Have you ever had someone you love tell you that you're not good enough? That you'll never find happiness because of who you are? Well, my mother spent 26 years convincing me I was unmarriageable. Then one rainy Tuesday evening, everything changed when a stranger walked into my bookstore and turned my entire world upside down. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The rain was hammering against the windows of chapter and verse when my phone buzzed for the third time that evening. I already knew who it was without looking. My mother had a sixth sense for calling at the worst possible moments. The bookstore was nearly empty except for Mrs. Patterson browsing the romance section and a college student hunched over his laptop in the corner cafe area. "Eleanor, sweetheart, I just got off the phone with Mrs. Chen from the grocery store." My mother's voice crackled through the speaker before I could even say hello. "Her nephew David is still single, He's an accountant now, makes decent money. Maybe if you tried a little harder with your appearance." I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the rain create rivers down the street. At 26, I'd heard variations of this conversation approximately 1,000 times. According to Margaret Whitfield, my loving but brutally honest mother, I was too bookish, too independent, too opinionated, and far too comfortable in oversized sweaters and jeans to ever attract a suitable husband. "Mom, I'm at work," I said, straightening a display of bestsellers that didn't need straightening, "and I'm not interested in meeting David Chen or his accounting degree." "That's exactly your problem, Eleanor. You're too picky. Do you think I was head over heels for your father when we first met? Marriage isn't about butterflies and romance novels. It's about finding someone reliable who can provide for a family." The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up to see a man in an expensive-looking coat shaking rain from his dark hair. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of confident posture that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. "I have to go, Mom. A customer just walked in." "Fine, but think about what I said. You can't run that little bookstore forever, and you're not getting any younger. Pretty soon, even David Chen will be out of your league." I hung up and slipped the phone into my pocket, pasting on my customer service smile as the stranger approached the counter. Up close, he was even more striking. Sharp jawline, piercing gray eyes, and an air of quiet intensity that made me suddenly conscious of my faded University of Portland t-shirt and the pencil stuck behind my ear. "I'm looking for a first edition of The Great Gatsby," he said, his voice carrying a slight East Coast accent. 1925, if you have it." I blinked, surprised. Most people who wandered into chapter and verse were looking for the latest thriller or self-help book, not rare literary editions that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "That's quite specific," I said, moving around the counter. "I might have something in our rare books section. May I ask what the occasion is?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "It's for my grandmother. She's turning 90 next week, and she mentioned once that she had a first edition that was lost in a house fire years ago. I thought I'd try to replace it." Something in my chest fluttered unexpectedly. Here was this obviously wealthy, intimidatingly handsome man wanting to buy a priceless book for his grandmother's birthday. It was the kind of gesture that belonged in the romance novels my mother always mocked me for reading. "That's incredibly thoughtful," I said, leading him toward the back of the store where I kept the rare and collectible books locked in a climate-controlled case. "Your grandmother has excellent taste. Fitzgerald's prose is absolutely timeless." "You're a fan?" "Guilty as charged. I actually have a degree in English literature, which according to my mother makes me completely unemployable in the real world." I immediately regretted oversharing, but something about this stranger made me feel unexpectedly comfortable. He laughed, a rich sound that seemed to fill the entire bookstore. "Well, your mother clearly doesn't understand the value of literary appreciation. Some of the most interesting people I know have impractical degrees." I unlocked the display case with slightly trembling fingers, acutely aware that he was standing close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and woodsy that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Here we are," I said, carefully lifting out a pristine copy wrapped in protective tissue. 1925 first edition, dust jacket intact. It's not in perfect condition. There's some fading on the spine and a small tear on the back cover, but it's authentic. He examined the book with the reverence of someone who understood its value, turning it over gently in his hands. It's perfect. How much? $3,000, I said, trying to sound professional despite the fact that this was easily the most expensive sale I'd ever made. I can provide documentation of authenticity, of course. Done. He didn't even blink at the price, just pulled out a black credit card that looked heavier than my entire wallet. As I processed the payment, I couldn't help but steal glances at him. There was something almost magnetic about his presence. The way he carried himself, the expensive cut of his clothes, the fact that he could drop $3,000 on a book without a second thought. He was clearly from a different world than mine, the kind of world where people didn't worry about making rent or whether their small business would survive another slow month. You know, he said while I carefully wrapped the book, I don't think I caught your name. Eleanor, I said, then immediately felt foolish for not offering my last name like a normal person conducting business. Eleanor, he repeated, and somehow my ordinary name sounded sophisticated when he said it. I'm James Blackwood. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. Well, Mr. Blackwood, your grandmother is very lucky to have someone who cares so much about making her happy. She practically raised me, he said, his expression softening. My parents traveled constantly for work when I was young, so I spent most of my childhood at her house in Connecticut. She's the one who taught me to appreciate good books, actually. Used to read to me every night from her extensive library. There was something vulnerable in his voice that made my heart skip. This wasn't just a wealthy man throwing money around. This was someone who genuinely loved his grandmother and wanted to give her something meaningful. That sounds wonderful, I said, handing him the carefully packaged book. She sounds like an amazing woman. She is. She'd probably like you, actually. She's always telling me I need to meet someone who appreciates literature and isn't impressed by. He gestured vaguely at his expensive clothes and watch. All the superficial things. Before I could respond to that loaded comment, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression immediately shifted back to business mode. I'm sorry, I have to take this, he said, but he hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something else. Thank you for the book, Eleanor. Your mother is wrong, by the way. I stared at him in confusion. I'm sorry? About you being unmarriageable. Anyone who can discuss Fitzgerald with genuine passion and runs a bookstore like this clearly has excellent judgment and interesting priorities. Some men would find that incredibly attractive. Heat flooded my cheeks as I realized he'd overheard my phone conversation with my mother. Before I could stammer out a response, he was already heading toward the door, phone pressed to his ear. Yes, I have the quarterly reports, I heard him say as the door chimed behind him. Tell the board I'll be there in 20 minutes. I stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the space where he'd been standing, my mind reeling. Had that really just happened? Had a complete stranger? An obviously wealthy, devastatingly attractive stranger just offended me against my mother's harsh words? Mrs. Patterson approached the counter with a stack of romance novels, breaking me out of my daze. Who was that handsome young man? She asked with a knowing smile. He seemed quite taken with you. Just a customer, I managed, though my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. He bought a book for his grandmother. Mrs. Patterson said, clearly not buying my casual tone. Well, whoever he was, he couldn't take his eyes off you. Mark my words, dear, you haven't seen the last of him. As I rang up her books, I couldn't shake the memory of James Blackwood's gray eyes or the way he'd said my name. Mrs. Patterson was probably just being kind, but something about the encounter felt significant in a way I couldn't quite explain. The rain had stopped by the time I closed the store that evening, but I found myself replaying every moment of our conversation as I walked to my car. $3,000 would make a real difference for the bookstore's monthly numbers, but that wasn't what had my heart racing. It was the way he'd looked at me like I was interesting, like my thoughts on literature mattered, like maybe my mother was wrong about everything she'd spent years telling me about my prospects for happiness. 3 days passed without any sign of James Blackwood, and I began to convince myself that Mrs. Patterson had been wrong. He was probably back in whatever gilded world he came from, having forgotten all about the bookish woman who'd sold him a dusty old novel. Thursday morning brought my weekly coffee date with my best friend Sarah Chen. Yes, the same Chen family my mother was always trying to set me up with, though Sarah and I had been laughing about our mother's matchmaking attempts since high school. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "You look different," Sarah said the moment I slid into our usual booth at Riverside Cafe. She was already halfway through her latte, having arrived early from her shift at Portland General Hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse. "Different how?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was going. "I don't know, glowy, like you've got a secret." Sarah's dark eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Please tell me you finally stood up to Aunt Margaret about her constant criticism." I nearly choked on my first sip of coffee. Sarah had called my mother Aunt Margaret since we were kids, despite no actual relation, and she was one of the few people who dared to openly criticize my mother's harsh treatment of me. "Not exactly," I said, then found myself telling her everything about Tuesday evening. The phone call, the mysterious customer, the $3,000 book sale, and most embarrassingly, his comment about my marriageability. Sarah's eyebrows climbed higher with each detail. "Wait, back up. This guy overheard your mom being awful to you and actually defended you? To your face?" "It was mortifying," I groaned, hiding behind my coffee mug. I probably looked like a complete mess, and there he was making it sound like I was some kind of catch. "Eleanor Martinez Whitfield," Sarah said, using my full hyphenated name like she had since we were 12. "You are completely missing the point. This man spent $3,000 in your store, engaged in intelligent conversation about literature, bought a thoughtful gift for his grandmother, and then told you, a complete stranger, that you were attractive and interesting. Those are not the actions of someone just being polite." Before I could argue, Sarah's phone buzzed with the text. She glanced at it and grinned. "Speaking of interesting developments, my brother David wants to know if you've changed your mind about meeting him for dinner." She laughed at my horrified expression. "I'm kidding. I already told him you'd rather eat glass than go on a pity date arranged by our mothers." "You're terrible," I said, but I was smiling despite myself. Sarah had always been my buffer against both our family's well-meaning but misguided attempts at matchmaking. "I'm realistic. You've been holding out for someone who gets you, and maybe this James guy is exactly that." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "What did you say his last name was again?" "Blackwood. James Blackwood. Why?" Sarah's eyes widened, and she immediately pulled out her phone. "Eleanor, please tell me you're joking." "About what?" She turned her phone screen toward me, showing a Google search result for James Blackwood, Portland. The first image was unmistakably him, the same sharp features and confident smile, but wearing a tailored suit instead of the rain-soaked coat I'd seen him in. "James Blackwood," Sarah read aloud, "CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, one of the largest private investment firms on the West Coast. Estimated net worth, $2.8 billion. The coffee shop seemed to tilt around me. "That's impossible." "Look at this," Sarah continued scrolling. "He graduated from Harvard Business School, sits on the boards of 3 major charities, and was named one of Fortune's 40 under 40 feet last year. Eleanor, you didn't just meet some wealthy guy who likes books. You met one of the most eligible bachelors in the Pacific Northwest." I stared at the phone screen, trying to reconcile the James I'd met, the man who'd spoken so tenderly about his grandmother, with the polished executive smiling back at me from magazine covers. "This is insane," I whispered. "Why would someone like that even notice someone like me?" "Because," Sarah said firmly, "you're smart, interesting, and genuine. All things that are probably rare in his world of business meetings and charity galas." My phone rang, interrupting my spiral of disbelief. My mother's name flashed on the screen, and I nearly declined the call before remembering she'd been texting me all morning about something important. "Hi, Mom." "Eleanor, thank goodness. I've been trying to reach you all morning. Mrs. Henderson from the country club just called with the most incredible news." I met Sarah's eyes across the table, both of us bracing for whatever social manipulation my mother had discovered now. Apparently her daughter Melissa was at some fancy charity event last night, and she overheard the most interesting conversation. "You know that bookstore of yours that I'm always telling you will never make you any real money? Chapter and verse isn't just that bookstore, Mom, it's my business." Quote, Well, apparently James Blackwood, the billionaire who owns half of downtown Portland, was telling someone at this event about finding the most wonderful rare book dealer. He went on and on about this knowledgeable young woman who helped him find a first edition for his grandmother. My blood turned to ice. Sarah was gesturing frantically at her phone, having apparently found more articles about James. That's interesting, I managed. Interesting? Eleanor, this is a golden opportunity. Mrs. Henderson said he seemed absolutely enchanted by whoever this book dealer was. If you could somehow get an introduction. Mom, I have to go. But sweetheart, think about what this could mean for your future. A man like James Blackwood could change everything for you. You'd never have to worry about money again, and you could finally give up that impractical bookstore and... I hung up and immediately put my phone on silent. Sarah was reading something on her screen, her expression growing more incredulous by the second. What now? There's a whole article here about his dating history. Apparently he's been linked to actresses, models, socialites, but never seriously. The article says he's notoriously private and selective. She looked up at me with excitement. Eleanor, don't you see? He chose to spend time talking to you when he could have just bought the book and left. He lingered, he engaged, he complimented you. Because he was being polite to a store clerk, I protested, though even as I said it, I remembered the way he'd looked at me when discussing Fitzgerald, the slight hesitation before he left, the unexpected personal comment about my mother being wrong. Store clerks don't usually get $3,000 sales and personal conversations about literature, Sarah pointed out. And they definitely don't get defended against their mothers by complete strangers. The cafe door chimed and I looked up automatically, a habit I'd developed over the past 3 days, much to my own annoyance. But this time, my breath caught in my throat. James Blackwood stood in the doorway, scanning the room with those penetrating gray eyes. He was dressed more casually today, dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But he looked every inch the successful executive Sarah had shown me in those articles. His gaze found mine across the crowded cafe, and his face lit up with what looked like genuine pleasure. He began making his way through the tables toward us, and I felt like I might hyperventilate. Oh my God, Sarah whispered. Is that him? Play it cool, I hissed back, though my own voice was shaking. Eleanor, James said as he approached our table, and again my name sounded impossibly elegant in his voice. What a pleasant surprise. James, hi. I stood up awkwardly, bumping into the table and nearly knocking over my coffee. This is my friend Sarah. Sarah Chen, she said, extending her hand with a knowing smile. I've heard so much about you. All good things, I hope, he said, shaking her hand, but his eyes remained on me. I was hoping I might run into you again. I wanted to thank you properly for tracking down that book. My grandmother was absolutely thrilled. I'm so glad, I said, hyper-aware of how casual I looked in my weekend clothes compared to his effortless sophistication. How was her birthday? Perfect. She spent the entire evening reading passages aloud to the family and telling stories about reading Fitzgerald when she was young. You gave her exactly what she didn't even know she was missing. The way he looked at me when he said it made my knees weak. There was something in his expression that suggested he might be talking about more than just his grandmother's gift. Would you like to join us? Sarah asked innocently, though I could see the mischief in her eyes. I don't want to intrude, James said, but he was already pulling out the empty chair next to me. Not at all, Sarah continued. I was just telling Eleanor how rare it is to find someone who appreciates good literature these days. Most people are so focused on material success that they forget about the things that actually matter. I wanted to kick her under the table, but James just smiled. I completely agree. Some of the most successful people I know are also the most culturally ignorant. They can discuss profit margins for hours, but couldn't tell you the difference between Hemingway and Steinbeck. Exactly, Sarah exclaimed. Eleanor has a degree in English literature, but her mother thinks it makes her unemployable. Can you imagine? This time I did kick her, but James was already responding. That's incredibly short-sighted. Literature teaches critical thinking, empathy, and cultural awareness, all essential skills in any field. Plus, running a successful bookstore requires business acumen, customer service skills, and extensive knowledge of market trends. Your mother clearly doesn't understand what real value looks like. The fact that he was defending me again, this time to my best friend, made something warm bloom in my chest. Sarah was practically beaming at this point. I keep telling her the same thing, she said, but sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see things clearly. James's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with obvious reluctance. I'm sorry, but I have a meeting I can't reschedule. He stood, then hesitated. Eleanor, I know this might be presumptuous, but would you be interested in having dinner with me tomorrow night? There's something I'd like to discuss with you. My brain is completely short-circuited. Sarah was nodding encouragingly, but all I could think about was the vast difference between his world and mine. Yes, I heard myself say. That would be nice. Perfect. I'll pick you up at 7? When I nodded, he smiled. I'm looking forward to it. After he left, Sarah and I sat in stunned silence for a full minute. Eleanor, she finally said, I think your life is about to change completely. Friday evening arrived with all the subtlety of a freight train. I had spent the entire day alternating between excitement and sheer panic, changing outfits 4 times before settling on a navy dress that Sarah had insisted I buy months ago but had never worn. It's just dinner, I told my reflection for the 100th time, applying lipstick with trembling hands. People have dinner all the time, it doesn't mean anything. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. Nothing about James Blackwood was ordinary, and I had the sinking feeling that this dinner would be anything but casual. At exactly 7 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I grabbed my purse and jacket, taking one last look around my modest apartment. The overflowing bookshelves, the secondhand furniture, the stack of unpaid bills on my kitchen counter. Everything about my life suddenly felt small and inadequate. James stood on my doorstep looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine, wearing a black suit that had clearly been tailored specifically for him. But what struck me most was the genuine smile that spread across his face when he saw me. You look beautiful, he said, and the way he said it made me believe it might actually be true. Thank you, I managed, locking my door with hands that were definitely not shaking. You clean up pretty well yourself. Quote. He laughed, that rich sound I was beginning to associate with the flutter in my chest. I should probably mention that we're not going to what most people would consider a typical restaurant. My stomach dropped. Oh, should I have dressed differently? You're perfect, he said quickly, then seemed to catch himself. I mean, you're dressed perfectly. I just wanted to prepare you because I made reservations at Le Bernardin. I stopped walking. Le Bernardin was the most exclusive restaurant in Portland, the kind of place that required reservations months in advance and charged more for a single meal than I typically spent on groceries in a week. James, I can't afford. You're my guest, he said gently, placing a hand lightly on my back to guide me toward a sleek black car that was definitely not what I'd expected. I invited you, which means I'm paying. Please don't argue with me about this. The car was actually a Tesla, expensive, but not ostentatiously so, and I felt slightly relieved that he wasn't the type to show up in a limousine. As we drove through downtown Portland, James seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him before, asking about my day and telling me about his grandfather's reaction to the Gatsby book. She actually cried, he said, stopped at a red light. Apparently it was the exact same edition she'd lost, down to the specific printing. She said it felt like getting a piece of her youth back. That's incredible, I said, touched by the obvious love in his voice. Books have a way of holding memories like that. They become more than just stories. Exactly, you understand that in a way most people don't. He glanced at me as the light turned green. It's refreshing to talk to someone who values things that can't be measured in profit margins. Le Bernardin was everything I'd imagined and more. Crystal chandeliers, pristine white tablecloths, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that made me want to whisper. The maitre d' greeted James by name and led us to a secluded corner table with a view of the city lights. Mr. Blackwood, your usual table, the man said with the kind of deference that suggested James was a regular customer. Chef Morrison has prepared something special for this evening. As we settled into our seats, I couldn't help but feel like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The other diners looked like they belonged here, women in designer dresses and men in expensive suits, all speaking in the confident tones of people who never worried about money. You seem nervous, James observed, and I realized I'd been fidgeting with my napkin. I am nervous, I admitted. This isn't exactly my usual Friday night scene. What is your usual Friday night scene? I thought about last Friday, takeout Chinese food, a romance novel, and old episodes of Pride and Prejudice on my laptop while wearing pajamas by 8 o'clock. Something significantly less glamorous, I said with a laugh, usually involving books and comfortable clothes. That sounds perfect, actually. His voice was so sincere that I looked up from the intimidating array of silverware to meet his eyes. I spend most of my evenings at business dinners or charity events, where everyone is performing some version of themselves. The idea of just relaxing with a good book sounds like luxury to me. Before I could respond, our server appeared with the first course, something artfully arranged that I couldn't immediately identify, but tasted incredible. As we ate, James asked me about the bookstore, seeming genuinely interested in the challenges of running a small business and the satisfaction I found in connecting readers with books they loved. It's not exactly a lucrative career path, I said, feeling compelled to acknowledge the obvious disparity between our situations. My mother reminds me of that pretty regularly. Your mother seems to have very specific ideas about what constitutes success, James said carefully. She means well, she just wants me to be secure, and in her mind that means marrying someone who can provide financial stability. I took a sip of wine, feeling the words tumble out before I could stop them. She thinks I'm too impractical, too independent, too set in my ways to attract the kind of man who could take care of me properly. And what do you think? The question was quiet, but something in his tone made me look up. He was watching me intently, and I had the strange feeling that my answer mattered more than I understood. Honestly, I think she's probably right about the marriage part. I've never been good at making myself smaller or more agreeable to please other people. I like my books and my independence and my quiet life. Most men find that either boring or threatening. Most men are idiots. Quote, the bluntness of his statement surprised a laugh out of me. That's quite a generalization coming from someone who presumably knows a lot of successful men. Especially successful men, he said with a wry smile. Trust me, I've sat through enough board meetings and networking events to know that professional achievement doesn't correlate with emotional intelligence or the ability to appreciate what actually matters. The conversation flowed as easily as it had in the bookstore, ranging from literature to travel to our completely different childhoods. James told me about growing up with parents who were always working, about boarding school and the pressure of family expectations. I found myself sharing stories about helping my father in his workshop before he died, about the comfort I'd found in books during the lonely years that followed. I'm sorry about your father, James said when I mentioned how much I missed him. It sounds like you were close. He was the one who understood my love of books. He used to say that reading was the cheapest way to travel the world and meet interesting people. I smiled at the memory. My mother always thought he encouraged my impractical side too much. Maybe he just recognized that practical isn't the same thing as valuable. Before I could ask what he meant by that, James's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression immediately shifted. I'm sorry, but I need to take this call. It's about an acquisition we're finalizing. He stood, looking genuinely apologetic. I'll be right back. As he stepped away from the table, I found myself alone with my thoughts and the growing realization that this evening was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. James had a way of making me feel like the most interesting person in the room, despite the fact that he could probably buy and sell everything I owned without thinking twice about it. I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice the woman approaching our table until she was standing right beside me. Excuse me, she said in the kind of crisp, cultured voice that suggested expensive education and even more expensive lifestyle. You're dining with James Blackwood, aren't you? She was beautiful in the way that required significant time and money to maintain perfectly styled blonde hair, flawless makeup, and a designer dress that probably cost more than my car. Everything about her screamed wealth and sophistication. Yes, I said cautiously. I'm Victoria Ashworth, she said, as if the name should mean something to me. James and I have a history. I couldn't help but notice he's here with someone new. The way she said, someone new, made it clear that she found my presence both surprising and amusing. I felt heat creep up my neck as she looked me over with obvious assessment. I hope you're not getting the wrong idea about this evening, Victoria continued, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. James has a tendency to collect strays. people from different walks of life who interest him temporarily. But at the end of the day, he always comes back to his own world. We all do. Before I could formulate a response, James returned to the table. His face went carefully blank when he saw Victoria. Victoria, I didn't know you were dining here tonight. Darling, she purred, leaning down to kiss his cheek in a gesture that was clearly meant to mark territory. I was just getting acquainted with your friend. She seems lovely. The pause before friend was deliberate and pointed. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Eleanor, this is Victoria Ashworth. Victoria, Eleanor Whitfield. Charmed, Victoria said, though her tone suggested she was anything but. Well, I should get back to my table. Enjoy the rest of your evening. As she glided away, I felt like I'd been hit by a very elegant truck. James sat down, running a hand through his hair in obvious frustration. I'm sorry about that. Victoria can be intense. She's beautiful, I said, hating how small my voice sounded. She's also manipulative, self-centered, and utterly lacking in empathy, James said firmly. We dated briefly 2 years ago, and she's never quite accepted that it's over. But Victoria's words echoed in my mind. James has a tendency to collect strays, people from different walks of life who interest him temporarily. Was that what I was to him? A temporary diversion from his real life? The rest of dinner passed in a blur of exquisite food and polite conversation, but the easy intimacy we'd shared earlier felt fractured. I couldn't stop thinking about Victoria's warning, about the obvious differences between her world and mine, about the fact that James probably did have a history of dating women who looked like they belonged on magazine covers. As we drove back to my apartment, James seemed to sense my withdrawal. You've been quiet since Victoria left, he said finally. What did she say to you? Quote, I considered lying, but something about the concern in his voice made me tell the truth. She implied that you have a pattern of dating outside your social circle as a kind of novelty, and that eventually you always go back to people from your own world. James pulled over so abruptly that I grabbed the door handle. He turned to face me, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. Eleanor, look at me. When I met his eyes, he continued. Victoria Ashworth is a bitter woman who can't stand the idea that I might actually prefer someone genuine over someone who is bred to be the perfect society wife. What we have, this connection, this conversation, the way you make me feel like myself instead of just my bank account, that's not a novelty, that's real. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. James. I know we come from different worlds, he said quietly. But maybe that's exactly why this matters. Before I could respond, he leaned across the car and kissed me. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. When James pulled back, his eyes searched mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have asked first. Don't apologize, I whispered, my hand unconsciously touching my lips. I wasn't expecting. Neither was I, he admitted, his voice rough. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. I've dated women like Victoria my entire adult life, women who fit perfectly into my world, who knew exactly what was expected of them, and I was miserable. Before I could respond, his phone started ringing insistently. He glanced at it and cursed under his breath. It's my assistant. This acquisition is falling apart. And apparently I'm the only one who can fix it. He looked at me apologetically. I have to take this, but can we continue this conversation tomorrow? Maybe somewhere more private than a car on the side of the road? I nodded, not trusting my voice. James answered his phone as he pulled back onto the road, immediately diving into what sounded like a complex business crisis. I listened to him handle what was clearly a multi-million-dollar problem with calm authority, and the reminder of just how different our lives were hit me like a cold shower. When we reached my apartment, James walked me to the door despite being deep in discussion about contracts and deadlines. I'll call you tomorrow, he said, covering the phone's microphone. We need to talk properly. I unlocked my door and turned back to say goodnight, but he was already walking back to his car, phone pressed to his ear, completely absorbed in his other world. Inside my apartment, I collapsed onto my couch and stared at the ceiling. Victoria's words kept echoing in my mind, mixing with the memory of James's kiss and the way he'd looked at me when he said he was miserable with women from his own social circle. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How did it go? Details immediately." Instead of responding, I turned off my phone and ran a hot bath. I needed time to think without well-meaning friends or interfering mothers adding their opinions to the chaos in my head. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I opened chapter and verse at 9, going through the motions of my weekend routine while replaying every moment of the previous evening. The bookstore was unusually quiet, giving me too much time to overthink everything. Around noon, the bell above the door chimed, and I looked up hopefully, but it was just Mrs. Patterson returning a book she'd finished. "You look troubled, dear," she said, studying my face with the perceptiveness of someone who'd raised 5 children. "Man troubles? Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been there." She leaned against the counter conspiratorially. "Want to talk about it?" Before I could decide whether confiding in a customer was professional, the door chimed again. This time it was my mother, wearing her determined expression and carrying a large shopping bag. "Eleanor, perfect timing," she said, barely acknowledging Mrs. Patterson. "I brought you some proper clothes for job interviews. It's time we got serious about finding you a real career." Mrs. Patterson raised her eyebrows and quietly excused herself, promising to browse the mystery section. I watched her go with envy. If only I could disappear into a good book and avoid this conversation. "Mom, we've talked about this. I'm not looking for another job." "Sweetheart, this little hobby has gone on long enough. You're 26 years old and you're still playing store in a building that barely pays for itself." She began pulling clothes from the bag, conservative blazers and pencil skirts that looked like uniforms for a life I didn't want. "Mrs. Henderson's nephew works in accounting at a law firm downtown. Starting salary is $50,000 a year plus benefits." "I don't want to work at a law firm." What you want and what you need are 2 different things. You can't live in a fantasy world forever, Eleanor. Books don't pay rent, and they certainly don't attract successful men who can provide security. I thought about James, about dinner at Le Bernardin, about the way he'd defended my choices to both Victoria and my mother without even knowing he was doing it. "What if I told you I met someone?" I asked before I could stop myself. My mother's eyes lit up with interest. "Someone with prospects? What does he do?" "He's in business. Investment management." "How much does he make?" The bluntness of the question shouldn't have surprised me, but it still made me wince. "I don't know, Mom. We've only been on 1 date." "Well, you need to find out, and more importantly, you need to make sure he's serious about you. Men will string along women like you for months without any intention of commitment." "Women like me?" "You know what I mean. You're not like those polished career women or society girls who know how to play the game. You're too honest, too naive. You give your heart too easily, and expect others to do the same." Her words stung because there was truth in them. I had always been the type to wear my emotions on my sleeve, to trust people's words at face value, to believe in fairy tale endings. "Maybe that's not a weakness," I said quietly. "It is when it leaves you alone and struggling to pay bills." My mother softened her tone. "I'm trying to protect you, sweetheart. I've seen what happens to women who chase romantic dreams instead of practical security. Your father was wonderful, but when he died, I was left with nothing but debt and a daughter to raise. I don't want that for you." Before I could respond, the door chimed again. We both turned to see James walking in, looking casually elegant in dark jeans and a gray sweater. His eyes found mine immediately, and he smiled, the kind of smile that made my knees weak. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, glancing between me and my mother with obvious curiosity. "Not at all," my mother said before I could speak, and I recognized the calculating look in her eyes. "You must be the friend Eleanor mentioned." "I'm Margaret Whitfield, Eleanor's mother." "James Blackwood," he replied, extending his hand with impeccable manners. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Whitfield." Quote. I watched my mother's face as she processed his name, saw the exact moment she made the connection. Her grip on his hand tightened slightly, and her entire demeanor shifted. "Blackwood," she repeated slowly, "as in Blackwood Enterprises." "That's right," James said easily, but I caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "How wonderful." My mother's voice had taken on the artificially sweet tone she used when she was trying to impress someone. Eleanor didn't mention you were such a successful businessman. We don't typically discuss business, James replied, his attention shifting back to me. I was hoping I could steal Eleanor away for lunch, if you don't mind. Of course not, my mother exclaimed, practically pushing me toward him. You two young people go enjoy yourselves. Eleanor, we can finish our conversation later. As we left the store, I could feel my mother watching us through the window, probably already planning my wedding to a man I'd known for less than a week. Your mother seems intense, James said once we were safely outside. That's one word for it. I was mortified by how obviously she'd shifted her attitude once she realized who he was. I'm sorry about that. She can be a bit overwhelming. She loves you, he said simply, even if she has a strange way of showing it. We walked to a small cafe a few blocks away, one of my favorite quiet spots that I was sure James had never noticed before. He seemed completely comfortable in the casual atmosphere, ordering coffee and a sandwich like he ate at neighborhood cafes every day. I owe you an apology for last night, he said, once we'd settled into a corner booth. I shouldn't have answered that call during dinner, and I definitely shouldn't have left things so unresolved between us. You don't need to apologize for doing your job. Yes, I do, because this us matters more than business. He leaned forward, his gray eyes serious. Eleanor, I need you to know that what Victoria said was wrong. You're not a novelty or a diversion. You're the first person I've met in years who makes me want to be better than just successful. My heart started racing again, but doubt crept in alongside the flutter of hope. James, we barely know each other. How can you be so sure? Because in 3 conversations, you've seen me more clearly than people I've known for years. You don't care about my money or my connections or what I can do for you. You care about books and stories and whether my grandmother was happy with her birthday gift. You make me remember what it feels like to be excited about something other than profit margins. But Victoria was right about one thing, I said quietly. We do come from different worlds. What happens when you get tired of playing in mine? James reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm. What if instead of me visiting your world or you visiting mine, we created something new together, something that belongs to both of us? Before I could ask what he meant, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at it and sighed. I have to go. There's a board meeting I can't miss. He squeezed my hand gently. But Eleanor, I meant what I said. This matters to me. You matter to me. He stood to leave, then hesitated. There's something I want to ask you, but I want to do it properly. Are you free tomorrow evening? Yes, I said, though I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever he had in mind. Good. I'll pick you up at 6. He smiled that devastating smile. And wear something comfortable. We're not going anywhere that requires designer clothes. After he left, I sat in the cafe for another hour, replaying our conversation and trying to make sense of the whirlwind my life had become. 3 days ago, I was a struggling bookstore owner whose mother thought she was unmarriageable. Now I was apparently dating one of the most eligible bachelors in Portland, and I had no idea what came next. When I finally returned to chapter and verse, my mother was still there, having reorganized my entire front display and apparently appointed herself as my personal stylist and career counselor. Eleanor, sit down, she said the moment I walked in. We need to have a serious conversation about your future. The look in her eyes told me this conversation was going to be anything but simple. My mother's serious conversation turned out to be a 2-hour lecture about seizing opportunities and not letting a good man slip away. She'd apparently spent the entire time I was at lunch researching James online, and her notebook was filled with bullet points about his net worth, his charitable contributions, and his eligible bachelor status in various magazines. Eleanor, do you understand what this means? She said, waving a printout of a Forbes article. This man could give you everything. Security, status, a future where you never have to worry about money again. But you have to be smart about this. What do you mean smart? I mean, you can't approach this the way you approach everything else in your life. All heart and no strategy. Men like James Blackwood don't marry bookstore clerks because of love. They marry women who can enhance their social standing, who understand their world, who can be assets to their careers. Her words felt like ice water. So you think I should pretend to be someone I'm not? I think you should become someone worthy of him. Take those clothes I brought. Get a proper job. Learn about his interests. Show him you're serious about building a life that matches his. After she finally left, I closed the store early and went home to stare at the pile of conservative business attire she'd left behind. Was she right? Was I being naive to think that James could actually care about me as I was? Sunday evening approached with agonizing slowness. I changed clothes 3 times before settling on dark jeans and a soft green sweater. Comfortable, as James had requested, but still flattering. When the doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock, my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. James stood on my doorstep looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him, wearing jeans and a casual button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. But what surprised me most was the nervous energy radiating from him. Something I'd never associated with the confident businessman I'd come to know. "You look perfect," he said, his eyes warming as they took me in. "Ready for an adventure?" "That depends on what kind of adventure you have in mind." He smiled mysteriously. "Trust me?" 20 minutes later, we pulled into the parking lot of Sunset Ridge Elementary School. I looked around in confusion. The building was clearly closed for the weekend, and I couldn't imagine why we were here. "James, what are we doing at school?" "Come on," he said, grabbing a large duffel bag from his trunk. "I want to show you something." He led me around to the back of the building, where a maintenance worker was waiting with keys. James thanked the man by name and handed him what looked like a substantial tip before unlocking a door that led to the gymnasium. "I still don't understand," I said as we walked through the empty hallways. "This is where I went to elementary school," James explained, pushing open the gym doors. "Before the boarding schools and private tutors, before my parents decided I needed a more appropriate education for someone of my social standing. The gymnasium had been transformed. String lights hung from the basketball hoops, creating a warm, magical glow throughout the space. In the center of the floor, there was a blanket spread with what looked like a picnic dinner, complete with books scattered around the edges. I stopped in my tracks, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of it all. "James, this is incredible, but why here?" "Because this is where I was happiest as a kid," he said softly, "before I learned that everything had to be about appearances and expectations. I used to hide in the library during recess and read adventure stories, dreaming about having a life that was exciting and meaningful instead of just profitable." He guided me to the blanket, where I could see he'd arranged an elaborate spread of food from what looked like several different restaurants: Chinese takeout, pizza, ice cream, and various desserts that definitely didn't come from Le Bernardin. "I wanted to give you a picture of who I really am," he continued, settling down beside me. "Not the guy in expensive suits who takes meetings about acquisitions, but the person I was before I learned to be what everyone expected." We spent the next hour eating and talking, the conversation flowing even more easily than it had at dinner. James told me about his childhood dreams of becoming a teacher or a writer, about the pressure he'd felt to take over the family business, about the loneliness of success that had everything to do with money and nothing to do with happiness. "I built exactly the life my parents wanted for me," he said, lying back on the blanket and looking up at the string lights. "Successful company, impressive net worth, all the right social connections. And I was miserable every single day." "What changed?" I asked, settling down beside him. "You walked into my life and reminded me what it felt like to have a conversation about something that mattered. To meet someone who cared more about whether my grandmother was happy than whether I could afford a $3,000 book." I turned to look at him, and the sincerity in his expression took my breath away. "James, I know this is crazy," he said, rolling onto his side to face me. "I know we've only known each other for a week. But Eleanor, you've changed everything for me. You've made me remember who I wanted to be before the world told me who I had to become." Before I could respond, he sat up and reached for something in his jacket pocket. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the small velvet box in his hands. "This isn't what you think," he said quickly, seeing my expression. "Well, it is and it isn't." He opened the box to reveal not an engagement ring, but a delicate silver key on a chain. "This is the key to a building downtown," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "It used to be a warehouse, but I've been converting it into something special. I was going to wait longer to show you, but after what Victoria said, after meeting your mother, I realized that waiting might mean losing you to doubt." He helped me put the necklace on, his fingers gentle against my neck. "I want to show you what I mean when I say we could build something new together. Something that's ours." The building was only 10 minutes away, a beautiful old brick structure in the arts district that I'd admired countless times while walking downtown. James led me through the front entrance, and I gasped at what I saw. The space had been transformed into the most beautiful combination bookstore and community center I'd ever imagined. There were towering bookshelves filled with both classic and contemporary titles, comfortable reading nooks with oversized chairs and good lighting, a cafe area with exposed brick walls, and what looked like event space for readings and book clubs. "James, what is this?" "It's yours," he said simply. "I mean, it's ours, if you want it to be. I started planning this before I even met you, actually. I'd been thinking about what would make me happy instead of just successful, and I kept coming back to the idea of books and community and creating a space where people could discover stories that changed their lives." I walked through the space in amazement, taking in every carefully planned detail. There was a children's section with tiny chairs and bright colors, a rare books room with climate control and security, even a small apartment upstairs that could serve as living space. "I don't understand," I said, though my heart was racing with possibilities I didn't dare believe. "Why would you do this?" "Because I'm in love with you," he said, the words echoing through the empty space. "I know it's too soon to say that. I know it sounds impossible, but it's true. And more than that, I'm in love with the person I am when I'm with you. You make me want to build something meaningful instead of just profitable." Tears pricked at my eyes as I looked around the space again, seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't just a business opportunity. It was a dream made manifest, a future I'd never dared to imagine for myself. "What about your company? Your board meetings and acquisitions?" "I'll still run Blackwood Enterprises, but I'm restructuring everything. Hiring more people to handle the day-to-day operations so I can focus on projects like this. Projects that matter." I walked to the center of the main floor, trying to process everything he was offering. It was everything I'd ever wanted and more: the bookstore of my dreams, financial security, and a man who saw me not as someone to change, but as someone worth building a life around. "There's just one problem," I said, and James's face fell. "What?" "My mother is going to take full credit for this when she finds out you proposed in a bookstore." James's relieved laughter filled the entire space. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes to the bookstore, yes to building something beautiful together, and yes to seeing where this incredible thing between us leads." I smiled up at him. "But if you ever want to make it official, you should probably ask me properly." "I can work with that timeline," he said, pulling me into his arms. "We have nothing but time." As he kissed me, surrounded by thousands of books and infinite possibilities, I couldn't help but think about how wrong my mother had been. I wasn't unmarriageable because I was too bookish or too independent or too set in my ways. I was exactly the right person for someone who valued authenticity over appearances, substance over status, and love over convenience. 6 months later, Chapter and Verse Community Books opened to a line around the block. The Portland Tribune ran a feature story about the innovative partnership between local literary entrepreneur Eleanor Whitfield and philanthropist James Blackwood, though they completely missed the real story: that sometimes the best love stories begin with someone walking into your life and seeing exactly who you are, then choosing to build a future that honors both of your dreams. My mother, predictably, took full credit for everything. She'd started telling people at the country club that she'd always known Eleanor would find her perfect match, and that she'd encouraged the relationship from the very beginning. I didn't bother correcting her. After all, in her own misguided way, she'd been trying to protect me, and her fears about security and stability had come from a place of love, even if her methods had been questionable. Sarah was my maid of honor when James finally did propose properly, 6 months later, in the rare books room, with a first edition of Jane Austen's Emma and a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. The proposal was perfect, but what made it magical was that by then, We'd already built a life together that made sense, a partnership that honored both of our strengths and dreams. Mrs. Patterson became our first employee, managing the children's section with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found her true calling. The college student who'd been studying in my old cafe became our weekend events coordinator. Even Victoria Ashworth showed up to our grand opening, though whether it was to support the business or to see what she'd lost was unclear. The most satisfying moment came 3 months after we opened, when my mother brought a group of her friends for a book club meeting. She introduced me to each of them as my daughter, the successful businesswoman, and for the first time in my life, I could hear genuine pride in her voice. "You know," she said as the evening wound down, "I always knew you had excellent judgment about books. I'm glad you finally applied that same wisdom to choosing a life partner." I hugged her tightly, understanding finally that her harsh words had come from fear that I'd end up struggling and alone like she had after my father died. She'd been wrong about how to find security and happiness, but she'd been right about one thing. I deserved both. As I locked up the store that night, James waiting for me by the car, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed since that rainy Tuesday when a stranger had walked in looking for a first edition Gatsby. I'd gone from being the unmarriageable bookworm my mother worried about to being part of a love story that was better than any romance novel I'd ever read. But the best part wasn't the fairy tale ending or the financial security or even the man who'd seen my worth when I'd stopped believing in it myself. The best part was that I'd learned to value what I brought to the world. My love of books, my independence, my authenticity, instead of seeing those things as obstacles to overcome. Sometimes the most important lesson isn't learning to be what someone else wants you to be. Sometimes it's learning to be confidently, unapologetically yourself, and trusting that the right person will love you not despite your quirks and passions, but because of them. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that person will walk into your bookstore on a rainy Tuesday and change your entire world. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.